Hello there, Homeschool Nolan here to help you navigate learning in the digital age. Today I'd like to talk to you about one of my favorite lessons as a homeschooling parent so far. And that is teaching about the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Our kids are no doubt growing up in very interesting times. Our country seems more divided than ever on the issues of race and equality. Hence, I believe that learning about the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the approach he took to fighting racism and injustice is more important than ever now. Now, on a personal level, learning about the life of Dr. King was also one of the most memorable lessons I had when I was a kid in school. Back in the 80s, I was fortunate enough to have a 5th grade teacher named Miss Rousseau. Miss Rousseau was black, and she had grown up during the civil rights era movement of the 1960s. Even though it's been decades, I still remember sitting in her classroom, listening to her share her own personal thoughts of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a person who remembered him when he was alive. I especially remember her talking about Dr. King's funeral, where they had to sadly cover up part of his face to conceal the gunshot wound. Now, it's one thing to learn about history through books, quite another to learn it from people who actually lived through history and can share their personal thoughts and experiences. Now, I obviously am not Miss Rousseau, and I was not alive during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. But one of the things I do try to do as a history teacher for homeschoolers is to share real and personal stories whenever I can of people who actually lived through and remember history. And as a non-white kid who grew up in America after Martin Luther King Jr., and as a parent of non-white kids, I had to really think about how I wanted to teach about the life of Dr. King and why his life is still very relevant and important today. So how did I approach it? Well, I started by having each of the 3 8-year-olds in my homeschool learning pod read this book. Who was Martin Luther King Jr.? It's part of the WhoHQ series for kids, which we've been using for many other history lessons. One of the things I like about these books is that although they were written for kids, adults can enjoy them too, and they can serve as a quick review for parents. Now, I always consider myself familiar with the life of Martin Luther King, but 2 stories from his life really stood out for me while I was reading this book. My first story was the story of the Montgomery bus boycott. We probably all remember the name Rosa Parks. She was the woman who was arrested in 1955 because she refused to sit in the back of the bus. In response to this, Martin Luther King Jr. helped lead and organize the famous Montgomery bus boycott, where black citizens in Montgomery simply stopped riding the bus. They instead rode bicycles, walked, and organized carpools for each other so they could go to school or get to work. They did this for about a year before the Supreme Court of the United States finally said separating people by color on the bus was wrong and had to end. The Montgomery bus boycott was only the beginning, but it still serves as a powerful reminder of how peaceful, nonviolent protests can overcome injustice. Which leads me to my second favorite story from Dr. King's life, and that was the letter from a Birmingham jail. In 1963, Dr. King was arrested for leading a peaceful civil rights protest in Birmingham, Alabama. While in jail, he wrote a famous letter using toilet paper and scraps of newspaper. In this famous letter from a Birmingham jail, he argued that people should disobey unjust laws, but he wrote that they should do so peacefully and be ready to accept the punishment or consequences as he did for disobeying the law. Dr. King wrote this letter in 1963. But how many of us today will be willing to go to jail today because we disobeyed a law which we felt was unjust? This was one of many questions I asked my homeschooling kids. But rather than just having me sit in front of them and teach, I had them first read the book, and then we gathered for a discussion. In our discussion, I asked them important questions like, what did Martin Luther King Jr. like to do when he was a child? And then we talked about what it was like living in the South 60 years ago. And then I asked them, what is segregation? What are civil rights? So we had really good discussions on what these really big words were. And we also talked about how life in the South in America was very different 60 years ago, especially if you weren't white, and how our lives are better today because of civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. After talking about his life, we then concluded by watching a video clip of Martin Luther King Jr. giving perhaps his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech, which he delivered on the Washington Mall on August 28, 1963. I can't think of a better way to end a lesson on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. than watching his famous I Have a Dream speech. His dream that his 4 little children will quote, one day live in a nation where they will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This is a dream that is just as relevant today as it was in 1963. So if you haven't yet, I highly encourage you to watch this speech again and think about what Dr. King's words mean to you, and ask your kids what his words mean to them. I really believe that every child growing up in America today is better off because of Martin Luther King Jr. But our children are no doubt also growing up in a world that is in many ways more divided than it was in 1963. Unfortunately, racism and injustice still exists. But the life of Martin Luther King Jr. still offers a shining example of how peaceful, nonviolent protests combined with superb public speaking skills can overcome injustice and bring about positive change. And as Dr. King put it, let freedom ring. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.